So yeah, so my plan is to just like talk through. I mean, like you are a lawyer, barrister, and I'm a political scientist, so-called. We don't understand the world anymore.
Well, there's quite a lot of politics in my book. Yeah, although mine is all about the law. I mean, I've written more than 20 books, and I think maybe 2 or 3 of them have been about the law, including this one, and the others have all been about politics. So kind of the context of this one is more trying to understand like what's going on in global politics through a kind of legal and kind of sociology of the law sort of perspective.
Like, I mean, lots of things make sense to me as well, because I did my previous degree in Australia in the National University, and when I went there from Bangladesh, I was born in Bangladesh, and one of the books we are told to read is actually Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. What the hell?
Yeah.
And I can remember during that time, like John Howard, who's like, conservative, was in power. So obviously, they were promoting this kind of bullshit in the curriculum. And I think you mentioned about Friedrich Hayek quite a bit, and he's quite a favorite guy for Margaret Thatcher. I think Thatcher used to carry his book, isn't he?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's one of the anecdotes about her is that one of the Hayek books, a junior minister saying to her, "Oh, I don't understand what your program is really," and she whips out her Hayek and goes, "This is our law, this is our constitution, this is what we're going to do." I think it's a bit more complicated than that in reality. I mean, also one of the things I talk about in the book is how that generation of politicians, in a sense, steered away from neoliberalism in certain subtle ways. But I still think we're in a moment where certain ideas about the law, the government, the state are still unchallengeable, at least in conventional politics. And there are ideas which go back to that moment in the late 70s and the early 80s.
I mean, especially I teach Middle East politics as well. So I cover quite a bit of post 9/11 and US administration. And I can see lots of similarity how, this newcon suddenly came to the power with full force and then try to use all kind of executive power and bypass all those other things.
Yeah.
Or try to get some lawyers to actually redefine some of the things so that can fit in, like all those enhanced interrogation techniques.
Yeah.
So I can see lots of similarities there. One thing I kind of bring for my students is during the Ford administration after Watergate, the Ford came to power.
Sure.
And 2 of the people were with him was Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. So they are the very young men during that time. So I think Dick Cheney was like 32. I mean, he's the chief of staff. And then Donald Rumsfeld was 36, very, very young man. And suddenly they found that after Watergate, after Vietnam War, they found that, they just could not do anything because, I mean, so much, law around them because, after Vietnam War and the Watergate, they tried to constrain all those executive power. So these 2 guys were really, really frustrated. And these 2 guys will come back again with some kind of Reagan administration, behind the scene. Yeah. And I think Dick Cheney was so angry during that time about the lack of executive power. He wrote a big kind of op-ed during that time, so angry. And then after 9/11, these 2 people came back again. Now they have the opportunity to actually go through all those things. And then some of the things they did, just unbelievable. So you might relate some of the things from there.
Well, I mean, some of this is about executive power. Some of this is just about trying to kind of establish and deepen inequality. If you look at the equivalent people in Britain, there aren't people who hang around British politics as outsiders between about 1976-7, which is the period you're talking about, and say 2000 or 2010. What you get, I mean, you do get people who kind of spat out politics, can't achieve things in the late 70s and then come back. And the two or three I was thinking of was one, for example, is Jonathan Sumption, who's quite an important figure, who's a kind of lawyer who gets brought into the Supreme Court from nowhere. He's never been a judge, and he's parachuted up all the way to the British Supreme Court in about 2010 by David Cameron. And it's a very dodgy appointment. It's the only time in my adult lifetime that there's been a controversy about the appointment of judges. Now, what Sumption was doing in 76, 77, he was writing a book called Equality with Keith Joseph, who of course becomes a minister in Margaret Thatcher's government. And the whole theme of his book is there's too much equality and we have to get rid of it. And then Sumption kind of waits for about 25 or 30 years before his moment. Although, again, Sumption, I don't think he's successful, says Rumsfeld. Then now he's a judge, and he doesn't really have the ability to turn all that power and influence to actually changing our legal culture. Partly because there's enormous stink about his controversy, and he's always got to kind of tone things down and justify himself. But the other people I was thinking about when you were talking, who are kind of outsiders, who don't really get a chance to take off until a lot later, is if you think about the whole generation push Brexit through. A lot of them are people who are quite excited by Margaret Thatcher, and then absolutely cast down when she's removed as Prime Minister of the Conservative Party in about 1990. So they're people like, there's a kind of Lord Harris who organised a lot of think tanks which are going to ultimately push the ideas which lead to Brexit. He spends a long time in the political wilderness, but he's a bit older than the people you're talking about. Or maybe someone who's kind of the right age or a bit younger even is someone like, say, Nigel Farage, who's in his early 20s when Thatcher comes in, is still only, I think, about 30 when she's forced out of office, and then spends the next 15 years pursuing this kind of lonely struggle, part of which is just motivated by this immense desire to bring back, you know, his betrayed leader. But there are a lot of people involved in Brexit. Dan Hannon's another one who's spending 15 or 20 years in politics, sort of slowly climbing the greasy pole, but all the time thinking, you know, we'll get our moment in the sun again. And for them, obviously, it's 2016, it's Brexit, it's a sense that you can remake Britain. So it doesn't really happen here around Iraq. And I think some of the reasons why it doesn't is just that you've got a Labour government in power, and although obviously Iraq is incredibly dodgy in legal terms, etc., you know, they're not promoting people into office from that kind of far right background. That's not quite how Blairism works. But yeah, I mean, there are parallels. They just don't map quite exactly.
Because I mean, one of the things, like when I was reading your book, I mean, is when I study like America's new con, I mean, here I struggle to find them, whether these people are actually ideological. You know, Tories are all over the places. You know, like people like Boris Johnson and all, like, you know, David Cameron. I don't see any ideological, you know, they believe in something, you know, really. I mean, I really struggle to, you know, pinpoint that these are the things they really believe. You know, they talk about, you know, smaller state, they talk about, you know, less law, you know, like, I mean, all kind of things. But at the same time, I mean, you mentioned in your book that, you know, like, I mean, they don't like laws, but if you look at the background of the amount of law they're making, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, but I think you kind of have to take a couple of steps back. And I think to understand them, and I think now really we're getting towards things which are kind of core parts of my book. I think one of the things which is going on, and it's, if we don't start with politicians, start with how people feel in society. I think that there's, in society as a whole, there's this incredibly strong feeling which people have at this moment of time that somehow they don't have control over their own lives. And I think there are lots of different origins of that feeling, depending on which groups of people you're talking about in society. People mean different things by that. But I think that one of the things which is common is that if you think about our ability to influence people around us, our ability just to live our lives the way we want, all of us are bound by quite tight, invisible webs of relationships and now I'm talking about legal relationships. And I think there's a sense which a lot of people have in their head, that those kind of ties are getting thicker and more important, but they're also harder to understand. So if I try to put this as concretely as possible, the way I'd put it would be something like this. Think about you, Abdullah, yeah? You told me you're a university lecturer, so you've got an employment contract.
Mm.
Without looking at it, do you know what the 30 main clauses of your employment contract are? Okay. Now, even if you did, try and think, you might remember, okay, I remember there's a term saying how much I'm going to be paid, where I'm going to work. Most people's employment contracts cover 4 or 5 of the main things in which their employer has to do under law, in terms of their employer has certain obligations to them. Now, I wonder how many people in society, even if they had their employment contract in front of them, could say, all right, what are the missing terms? Right, you know, I'm entitled to sick pay, I'm entitled to a certain minimum wage, I'm entitled to protection from redundancy. If you start off listing the 70, 80, 100 main rights in employment law, how many people just faced with their employment contract would be able to say with confidence, all right, here are the things which I'm entitled to, which they aren't even written down, but I am genuinely entitled to. Now, if the answer is actually most people couldn't, then let's say you're a tenant, think about your tenancy contract. Could you name its main clauses? Could you identify what are the things which actually you have as rights or as obligations, which your landlord's missed out? Or an insurance contract, or you know, every time you click on online, you get a privacy notice saying, do you agree to our terms? You've assigned quite a large degree of control over your private data, maybe your images, for example. Data which can be used to make all sorts of complicated financial predictions, either about you or about society. You've just let someone else buy and trade that data. How many people either are conscious of doing that, or have a sense of how maybe they're protected against some of that to some extent by consumer law? And again, I think the answer is most people don't. So there's a sense that these legal relationships are more important, thicker and thicker and thicker, but people have less and less control over them. And that's part of this kind of rage we see in society, this kind of anger, this paranoia. Now, I think a kind of core theme of my book is that, I mean, I take it from conversation, so I'm going to just, in my head, I'm going to call you left wing.
Yes.
And I don't know, but let's just say that works. Yeah.
Great.
I'm
like extreme left. I mean, no.
Lovely. It seems to me that loads of right-wing politicians are able to talk to that element of the crisis in our lives, but hardly anyone on the left is able to talk to it. So, I mean, you know, you talk about neoliberals and populists, and it seems to me that all of them have got a story about how certain people, bureaucrats, alien people, lawmakers, whatever, are taking back control out of your life. And there are things you can do to give it back to people. So, you know, under Thatcher, this is all about economics. If we cut out all the law, replace it with economics, the market will be a much fairer, more democratic mechanism to give people control of their lives. So you'll pay less in taxes, except actually under Thatcher every year we paid more in taxes, and there'll be fewer laws, except actually there were more laws than there'd ever been. The 50% increase in the amount of laws, 50% increase in the length of every single law that's passed under Thatcher. And then what kind of happens is so long as we've got neoliberalism, this pattern constantly repeats itself. Like an example, yeah, when you get the Tories and the Lib Dems make their coalition in 2010, and they want this to be, they want to have something which are liberal Democrat policies, it can't just be Tory policies. So, all right, one thing we can do, we all agree, is that under Labour there are too many criminal laws, and we're going to reduce the number of criminal laws made. They set up an inquiry and a commission that would reduce the number of criminal laws they passed. You won't be at all surprised where this is going. After 2010, the Tories and Lib Dems in a coalition introduced a new crime, a new criminal law, every working day of the 5 years they're in power. So the volume constantly increases. And then I think by the time you get to the populists, you know, what's at the heart say of Brexit? It's this idea that we need to take back control. And how that works is you shine this laser-like light which focuses absolute intensity on the fact that under Europe, if you're a member of the European Union, you're subject to the European Court of Justice, you're subject to European directives and regulations and treaties. that has led to a big increase in the amount of law we have in Britain. So the idea is, right, Brexit will take back control. You, a voter, will look around at your politicians in Westminster, and you will have control over them, and all the laws from outside will disappear. So the amount of laws will be diminished. You'll have more control of your lives. And again, obviously that doesn't happen at all. What actually happens is that you see vast increase, all the supposed laws are supposed to vanish, like workplace laws or green laws are still there. And all the things that were supposed not to happen have actually happened. So I'm talking about that process of the right sort of like lying or failing to deliver on a part of its promise. But I'm only talking about it as part of this more general sense, which is like, why aren't the left talking about these things too? Why can't we have some sort of language under which we say, all right, when are there too many laws? When are laws too complicated? How could we have a better democratic relationship for each citizen in Britain, where we have more chance to understand our laws, and therefore we feel less powerless, and so on. And I'm just sort of intrigued and perplexed that we never seem to be able to do that on the left for whatever reason.
I mean, like, does it mean like the way the modern democracy is? With me, like the way the democracy works is extremely bureaucratic. And when you bring lots of bureaucracy, then I think the legal stuff comes automatic. So if you have got this kind of structure, you just cannot, get away from law. Rather, you will bring more law, because it's just like, it's not like, they're talking about democracy or this populist government things. But at the same time, do you think the people who are in power, they're also afraid that what they're doing, they might break laws. So they want to make sure that whatever they're doing, they're actually doing in the name of law.
Look, there's two different points there, yeah. If I can take the first point, which is about like, is this inevitable? And then the second point, like, what do the people in power want to do? Firstly, I don't think it's inevitable. If you were right that there's going to be there's bureaucracy now, there's going to be more bureaucracy in future, I think it's probably true that the more bureaucracy you have, logically you have more law. But it's also true the other way around too. The more laws you have, therefore the more bureaucracy you must have. Every time you make a law, the law might be we pay tax or don't pay tax in these circumstances. Suddenly people have got to check whether that tax has been rightly paid. So every law you write creates a civil servant, creates policeman, creates a court bailiff, whatever. An increase in law definitely leads to increase bureaucracy. But I kind of think if you treat that as just inevitable, I think that's kind of a bleak conclusion, because just the end result is people can get more and more alienated, more and more cross, and have less ability to change it. Yeah. I think what you kind of need to do is flip that round and say, in essence, what laws do you actually need? Yeah, I'll give you an example of the law we need and the law we don't need. The oldest laws in England are laws about murder and laws about assault. They're all the character of, like, the old Kentish laws say things like, for punching a man about the nose, a shilling. In other words, if you punch someone on the nose, then rather than just the previous traditions, you punch them, so they punch you, so their family member punches, so your family member, and so on and so on. Right, we'll stop that. We'll just say you pay 1 shilling, whether you pay it to family, whether you pay it to sex, that doesn't matter. Therefore, fewer people get assaulted. Now, laws like that, I can't see a problem with them. There's a certain basic level of just social regulation, which I think is necessary, desirable, whatever. But I'll contrast that to a different kind of law we have in Britain. Yeah, I do a lot of housing law. If I try to list all the different forms of tenure we have in housing law, so trying to work out what right a tenant has or a landlord has, if the tenant's asking the landlord paying too much rent, making me pay too much rent, if the landlord's saying I want the tenant to leave, what rights have I got? First question is, what kind of tenancy have they got? And right now, the kinds of tenancy you could have are, I'll try and get the main ones. A secure tenancy, an assured short-hold tenancy, an assured tenancy, all of those three are different. You have demoted tenancies, introductory tenancies, You have certain kinds of fixed term secure tenancies, which are different from the ordinary ones. You have specific forms of tenancies for asylum seekers, students, service occupiers, property guardians. And honestly, I could go on and populate that list another 2 or 3 times. Now, you might say, oh, well, we've got to have lots of forms of tenancies. That's just society becoming more mature and growing up. Well, like right now, for example, in Wales, they've just introduced the idea of a single standard form of tenancy, not in England, only Wales, where every single tenancy contract, in effect, has the same forms of security, whether you're renting from local association, private landlord, whoever. Now, that's a simplification process which you could do anywhere. There's nothing inevitable which says you have to have 15 different forms of tenancy rather than 2 or 1. And by simplifying it, you just give people a better chance to understand how their lives work. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So is bureaucracy inevitable? Yes. Is some degree of regulation inevitable? Yes. But could you have much more systematic processes of reducing unnecessary regulation and a democratic, benign process that has its end more equal society? You could have that. You could do that if politicians wanted to. And then the other half you asked me is like, what do the people at the top of society want, or at least the top political system want? I think some of the things you said rang true to me. I think we're in a moment where the problems with conservatives aren't like in the early 80s, the problems with conservatives then was they're massively ideological, they loved all the neoliberals, and just society was quite social democratic. Our politicians were more right-wing, ergo, what would have been better, have less right-wing politicians? Yeah, there are times like that. But in the last 10 years, I don't think essentially the problem with conservatives has been a surfeit of ideology in that way. I think there are still those sorts of ideological politicians, kind of the ideological cutters. Some of them are still around. And I talk about how some of the things which they would want to introduce, for example, notions of privatizing justice, are still going on and still happening, even though that's not like where the Conservative Party's been at for about 5 years. But those are still happening just because we're in a moment where it's easy to make that happen. I think the thing about the populists is that they're not really ideological cutters. They're definitely not ideological neoliberals. That's not what coheres them. But there are some things they are very ideologically committed to. And one of them is a stronger executive, including a stronger executive by taking that power from Parliament, by taking that power from the courts. And if you look at, when Boris Johnson had his Queen's speech recently, which is, dying days of his government, what are the last bits of policy he really wants to do? All of them are kind of authoritarian or soft authoritarian of that sort. A new police bill. We've had laws about the fixed term parliaments. We've had some laws about taking control of the electoral commission, laws about voter ID, laws about judicial review and make it hard for them to be challenged with judicial review. The next set of laws they were going to bring in were things like repeal of the Human Rights Act and replace it with, we can get into what it replaced with, but all of those things, they're not really about left, right, or cutting, or allowing, or states increasing spending, or reducing. What they're all about is saying, if you have got lucky enough to be part of the executive, i.e. a minister of the government, you should be able to do whatever you want in a completely untrammeled way, and completely free to do that. Now, then you said, well, are they trying to be above the law? And you could kind of read, say, the COVID stuff. I mean, I think that it was really fascinating to me, like how that panned out, because you go through some basic things, yeah. You could be on the left, you could be on the right. Your notion of good lawmaking is that good lawmaking is lawmaking which is simple, which is comprehensible. If you make a crime like murder, everyone knows what murder is a crime. It's very easy to not do it. But if you make a law where no one knows whether they've breached it or not, that's a problem. Another example of just bad lawmaking, I'm not talking about this in a particular political way, just like the technique of lawmaking, yeah? Good lawmaking is law made, particularly criminal law, has to be made through Parliament rather than by ministers, for a bunch of reasons, one of which is that Parliament discusses it a lot, so if there are mistakes, people point them out to you before it becomes law. Now, what happened under COVID was that first stage one, all the laws are made outside Parliament, they're all made by the executive with effectively no parliamentary approval at all. Then the second thing is a whole bunch of them that are really very draconian. You know, for example, there's some people personally I detest on the far right of British politics, like Piers Corbyn and the face mask removers, the anti-vax sort of people. But it felt like some of the legal changes were literally, it's Friday, Piers Corbyn's having a demo tomorrow, so we're going to have an anti-Piers Corbyn regulation. Now, all the history of lawmaking is, it's really stupid to make laws which are designed to target X individual, because they'll probably also make Y, Z, A, B, and C also break the law too. So then you get to the next stage where it starts to be like 20, 50,000 people breached the rules, they've all had fines, some, but very few, taken to court, quite a lot of them showing that the fine they got were illegal, whatever. Now the question is, kind of unusually in government, all right, have ministers breached the law? Now this is fascinating because really deep in how right-wing people think about the law is they love the idea that law is something which binds everyone. It's very similar to the notion that the markets, in theory, markets can't be gamed. There's no such thing as monopoly, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The market just creates a situation of raw equality for everyone. And that's exactly how they think about the law. It is in the right-wing imaginary, it's a good thing that even the rulers can be bound by the law, because of course they'd never break it. So suddenly from December last year, we've got Boris Johnson going, well, you know, he cycled, you're allowed to cycle at that point in your local area. Well, he cycled 7 miles away from where he lived. Is that still in his local area? You know, all these ministers going to, well, you know, if Boris Johnson breaks rules, it doesn't really count as breaking the rules. And then we get the much bigger version of that, which is the whole Boris Johnson parties. And, you know, everyone watching this will know what happens. I won't labour the story. The point I'm really building towards is that I cannot look at that process and say a bunch of politicians at the top of society planned and intended that it would have the effect that Boris Johnson would breach the rules, that everyone would see Boris Johnson breaching the rules, and he'd get kicked out of Prime Minister for breaching them. There must be a process which kind of have to fit into our way of explaining the world, which is that actually this process of bad lawmaking, chaotic lawmaking, arbitrary lawmaking, in this case actually had the unintended consequences of bringing down the rule maker. So they're not in control of it. And it'd be a real mistake to go into this thinking there's some ideological plan. There've been moments in world history like the 80s where there wasn't a kind of an ideological plan to drive things to the right. Whereas I think what you've got now is you've got an instinct, which is government, the executive wants to be more powerful compared to everyone else. Mm-hmm. But it for whatever reasons, quite a number of the kind of autocrats around the world are very bad at turning that into an actual plan for ruling autocratic. You know, if you think about Donald Trump, no one is going to, the one thing which Donald Trump achieved is he stacked the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. On every single other measure. Is there more of a Mexican wall than there was 5 years ago? Not really. Are there more deportations from America than there were 5 years ago? Not really. Mm-hmm. Is America winning its wars in the Middle East more aggressively than it was 5 years ago? Not really. So in terms of this desire to create authoritarianism, the desire's there and it's evident. Mm. But also there are things which in Britain and America and I think and I suspect in other parts of the world too, they're losing control of. And if the story was just we've gone from neoliberals to populists and they're winning, that'd be quite a bleak story. But the story is we've gone from authoritarians to populists and they're repeatedly incompetent. The things which are pushing them to power are also to some extent making them incompetent. To my mind, that's a much more optimistic story if you're on the left, because then you've got, you know, division, disagreement amongst ruling circles, that making themselves unpopular with the governed, and therefore creating the conditions, I think, for, you know, if there were left-wing people around the world who were only just canning, could see what was going on, opportunities for us to better explain the crisis, have a better set of answers to it, and then maybe, you know, earn the right to govern ourselves whenever.
I mean, would it be okay if I ask you a couple of technical questions about how this, like, you know, the legal people, you know, work? So like, if I see like American example, like when Trump was trying to ban Muslims, and we saw like lots of counter lawsuits against that. Hundreds, every state's trying to, overrule that. But here we did not see that kind of, counter, movement. But what you are saying that
we did in very, very small ways. And in fact, the legal process were in some ways almost identical.
Okay.
The Trump Muslim ban is occurring in, from recollection, about 2017.
Yeah.
So the main challenges to it take the equivalent form to what in Britain's judicial review.
Okay.
The Trump travel ban gets to the higher American courts. There are actually two Trump travel bans. The first one wins in what's effectively their court of appeals, but there's so many problems exposed with the law that they come up with a second travel ban, and that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's the old Supreme Court where there's only a Republican 5-4 majority. And the arguments run by Trump and his supporters are in essence that the president has control over foreign policy. That's his control. That's his area and his area alone. The Supreme Court don't deliver for him on the point of principle. They say, we're not going to assist you in your shift towards authoritarianism, but they do say, in broad terms, we accept the legislation is, and that's why there was a travel ban from then on for the remainder of the Trump presidency. If you kind of want to think of comparisons to that in Britain, the two obvious comparisons would be number one, when Theresa May tries to get Brexit through, or at least tries to get specifically the idea through that the Prime Minister can set the clock ticking on when Brexit will take effect. Is it Article 50, the first Gina Miller judicial reviews? So it's almost identical. And it's at the same time, it's 2017. Challenged in the courts. Ultimately, the big legal question is, in both the American and the British Supreme Courts, is can the president hear the Prime Minister? Do they have unlimited control over foreign policy? And can they use that to oust here Parliament and their Congress? And in essence, the UK courts strike down that argument, and the American courts don't strike it down. But one of the reasons why they don't strike it down in the end is because actually Congress had passed a bunch of laws which enabled you to make a Trump travel ban anyway. So it never quite becomes Prime Minister versus Parliament, President versus it doesn't quite, but only because actually, as well, the legislature had already given over. It wasn't fighting the president. But if you want another example, think about the Rwanda flight stuff. It's exactly the same. It's the government's taking control of immigration. It's doing this to win a political point. The courts didn't want to intervene. Two judicial reviews went to the High Court, Court of Appeal. They were like the Friday and the Monday, and then it went back to the Court of Appeal a second time for various reasons. In a very short expedited hearing on the Tuesday afternoon, like 9:30 at night. They went, okay, actually, we're persuaded at this point this would so infringe people's human rights that we won't let the flight go ahead. So honestly, it's exactly the same process.
No, because I mean, then I want to know, like, who are these lawyers who are, going after this kind of executive power to try to stop them? I mean, obviously, these are kind of good lawyers to my eyes, so they watch the government and then say, oh my God, they're doing it. We need to stop. Like how organized they are. Like, I mean, what kind of thing? Are you part of that kind of team as well? I know you work in a law.
Well, I'm a lawyer. The government characterizes us as lefty lawyers. There's quite a desire in general to say that this language is completely terrible and unfair. There's no such thing as left-wing lawyers. They're only lawyers doing our job. Personally, I quite like the label lefty lawyers. I mean, there are 3 or 4 chambers in Britain which specialise in doing, for example, judicial reviews against government over immigration law. My own chambers, I practice in chambers called Garden Court. We're one of those 3 to 4. I know some of the barristers who were in the court where the decision was taken that the Rwanda flight was illegal. There are kind of institutions which try and cohere the left within legal sphere. So sometimes we practice in different chambers: Garden Court, Doughty Street, Michael Mansfield's chambers. Sometimes you kind of get associational things, like there's a Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. There's also a society of labour. So yeah, the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers is also a society of labour lawyers, which has much closer links just to the Labour Party. There are things like because when you challenge the government through judicial review, you're being paid for by legal aid. So there are groups of specialist groups of legal aid lawyers working in housing, immigration, and so on. Obviously, there's things like the criminal barristers right now who are going on strike. That again is a process which brings people together. So it's not as if there's like a single legal left, but there is a league within our legal infrastructure in general. You know, my chambers, if we do employment work, we do it for workers rather than employers. If we do housing work, we do it for tenants rather than landlords. If we do immigration law, we're doing it for people who would otherwise be deported. We're not doing it for the state. And there's a kind of phenomenon in all these different areas of law who people, as it were, take the social justice side and organise and try and work together. And it's not, you know, there are reasons why Johnson kept on denouncing lefty lawyers, which some of them were just because, you know, the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, was a lawyer. So if you could get it into public consciousness that lefty lawyers were bad and untrustworthy people to be deprecated, he thought that would help him against the Labour parties. That's some of why he pushed it so hard. But if you kind of take it a more practical, common sense way, there is a legal left. And while you're never going to have exactly the same people in the room on every occasion, quite a lot of the people who are in the room on only one important occasion are people who know each other and they're used to working together in different ways.
Like, I mean, if I see this Boris Johnson's cabinet, I mean, they got a bunch of lawyers there as well, who are by profession, the lawyers. What's her name? Suella Bannerman, Dominic, Dominic Raab. I mean, why do
they weren't super experienced lawyers. None of them were people who had a particularly distinguished legal career. And this again is something that's very distinctive about this epoch in conservatism. You know, if you go back to the 80s, the Conservatives tried to bring into the cabinet the leading lawyers of the day, and people like Lord Hogg, for example, were they were seriously very highly respected lawyers. There are a whole bunch of reasons why right now the Tories are trying to bring in not very good junior lawyers. Some of it's to do with they do actually try to bring like even the expert Conservative lawyers. Like over Brexit, they tried to bring them in. They tried to get specialists in. But then what happens is these people get spat out again because they feel, to put it crudely, they feel a much higher degree of professional embarrassment. You know, so much of what Boris Johnson's been trying to do is going, well, you know, we signed an international legal treaty to work with the European Union over borders with Northern Ireland. Now we're going to tell everyone that we can just breach international law. And then if you spent 30 years working in the legal world and it really matters to you that you don't just say, well, we're not going to break the law. You know, all your mates are saying to you, wait a sec, how on earth can you be a smart, intelligent, sophisticated lawyer standing up for breaching the rule of law? So those people go in and then they get spat out very quickly. And the ones which are left are the kind of people who are more junior lawyers, who it's more about politics and willing to, if need be, sacrifice their legal credibility for the sake of winning a political argument. So that's some of the reason why they're quite junior. But what I'm trying to talk about in my book is just to get people to see that so much of this conflict is taking place on a legal sphere, and to grasp that if what you're really motivated by is just the idea of like winning lots of justice for people, winning lots of equality, put it in the most broad and nebulous way, repeatedly giving decisions to lawyers to make, even if the lawyers are now called judges, the judge is still a lawyer. There are massive problems with it. And the problems are that the law can only recognize certain kinds of demands for equality or for rights to a very limited extent. You know, law can never turn around and say, all right, we'll just give the factories to the workers. The law will never do that. The law can never, and this is a key thing, I think, which ticked about in some later chapters, which I don't know if you've got to yet, but the law can never turn around and say, we will recognise the rights of nature. And if people are repeatedly polluting, okay, any person in Britain can spot that, can complain about that, and if they're right, ultimately the polluters can be expropriated because they're then just misusing scarce natural resources in such a terrible way that must mean that the rights of property are overridden, and the law just cannot do that. We've had decades of judges sort of working down certain approved legal avenues and grooves which deliver certain results, but they'll never get one step towards that. And actually, if you're serious about the totality of the crisis we're in, including the environmental crisis, that's a real problem. And it includes it's a real problem for the left because, you know, when you talk to the most imaginative and exciting young environmental lawyers, to my mind, that they've got a massive strategic quandary, and part of the reason why nothing's changing is because of the situation they're in. And their quandary just goes like that, like this. Should we try and say there should be system environmental courts, which would potentially have that power to actually enforce all our treaties about, you know, about getting to net zero, etc. If you don't do that, then if you just say there's never going to be a legal route of mechanism to deal with the problem that we're all burning the planet, well, then we're going to carry on burning the planet. So that, doing nothing isn't the answer. But yeah, if we put our current set of lawyers in charge of it, with all the things they've been trained, if you look at all the previous processes whereby right wasn't recognised in law and then was recognised, like employment law, information law, we know what the judges did with those things in the first 10 or 15 years of those jurisdictions, when you just gave a bunch of judges who used to the law and what the law said was normal, you gave them that area of law. And what they did in each case was disastrous. They just created an area of law which would be about conserving the status quo rather than changing it. So doing nothing leads to ecocide. Doing a lot, but leaving our judges in charge of it, would probably also lead to ecocide. So what's the way through? And I think there's just lots and lots of people, you know, if you talk to lawyers for Extinction Rebellion, I sit down with them, I have coffee with them, you know, I'll go on their protests. But in that core group of people, there is not yet a plan that resolves that quandary. And until there is, it's very difficult to see how the law can be part of turning the situation around. And if you know the science of, you know, climate change at all, that's really, really troubling, because we're, you know, I don't know, if you were to burn all the oil in the ground right now, then, and which the major oil polluting companies have already bought up their rights to, then you're talking about that alone and nothing else. That alone would increase global temperatures by something like 5 degrees. You know, would overhit 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, all the supposed limits that we're trying to institute to say, you know, the parts of the world where people are living, you know, where a 5 meter increase on the water levels means cities are uninhabitable. If you try and see the world from the perspective of those people, with the burning that we've got locked in by current property rights, then they will not be saved. And you know, you can see this disaster being ever, ever, ever closer. And you know, at least people are saying, some people saying, well, there's a disaster, but no one in the legal sphere is doing the first step towards finding an answer to it.
Like, since you brought like environmental stuff, I mean, I really want to share this personal experience. I mean, we went to London, I think 2 weeks ago, for Marxist festival, like bunch of academics from Dundee. So we went there and we decided to stay in students' accommodation. So we were staying in UCL students' accommodation. So these accommodations don't have any air conditioner or anything. Okay? And what we found, that it's just unlivable. You just cannot live there. It's like a furnace. We are getting like roasted. And at night we tried to find fans anywhere. And we went to the kitchen, because there's a shared kitchen there. And we saw, like, you know, at least 20 fans there. So it means like that's the situation the students are facing. And I met a couple of students on the corridor, and I was telling them, how will you guys live here? I mean, this is insane. This is just insane. I mean, just cannot live here anymore. I mean, I tried to flee from London because I thought this city is not livable anymore.
Yeah, well, look, I'm in London today, and it's looking pretty bright outside. Yeah, and you know, all of this is posited on the climate being whatever the climate is today, and the climate in 10, 15 years is going to be that bit more hostile. And you know, London, you know, if you're trying to make the worst 100 cities in the world, I don't know that London would actually feature in the worst 100. There are a lot of places which are a lot worse.
Yeah.
But you know, it's kind of like this is a really rubbish analogy. But it's the only one I can think of right now. You know, it's the story of the frog in the boiling pan of water, which is so long as you just slowly increase the temperatures, at any one moment, the frog doesn't jump out. If you do it too fast, the frog goes, I'm burning, that jumps out. If you do it slowly, the frog will stand there and they boil to death. And that I feel kind of is where we all are in relation to that problem. But what I was just trying to do in the book is to insist to people, and one of the things which has made me happiest in the book was when I wrote, one of the people who contacted me, the book's not even published till Tuesday, but one of the pre-readers, a reviewer, who got quite excited by it is part of the Greenpeace legal team, who wanted people actually thinking about how do we find an answer to that problem. They got really excited by it, so they've shared it around all their team, and was, look, we're going to read this and think about it. It's lessons for us, and you know, as you can imagine, someone who's got relationships to universities, tries to promulgate ideas. The idea that, you know, the people who are going to have to find the answer to the problem, at least, you know, encouraging them to see about it, maybe giving them a language with which to confront it. Everyone knows the problem's there. I didn't invent the problem, but at least maybe getting them a way of talking about it. Some of these sort of horrible academic neologisms like juridification, de-juridification, they're horrible, but at least if you have a language to talk about the problem, that maybe that creates the space so other people can find an answer to some of these problems. I'm not suggesting that should be down to me or to any small group of people. It's got to be something you pass around the idea, and you hope other people run with it and do something with it.
I'm not sure, I mean, if I bring some more politics stuff, whether you will be, but I mean, let's try some of the political thing. I mean, the way I see, you know, the Western, this liberal so-called democracy, I mean, which is what you were saying, this neoliberal model, where, you know, they think that this will create equal society, you know, this market will deliver equality in the society. I mean, which we are not seeing any kind of, you know, that kind of things is going to happen. It's like the wealth is more concentrated, and, you know, we are seeing the rise of all those billionaires and millionaires around the world. And since the wealth is being concentrated, so that means the rest of the leftover will be, you know, shared by that, you know, huge amount of people, which is not sustainable in the long run anyway. And do you think there's a correlation between this scarcity, the rise of, you know, this oligarch, and then this rise of populism? This is very toxic, isn't it?
Look, it is, but I think it's globally or in Britain, it's more complicated than just scarcity and poverty creates populism. Because, you know, globally, global living standards around the world are actually going up. You know, I remember sort of, you know, way back in, I think, 2003, I was teaching in university before I had any thoughts from barrister. And I said, all right, I was made redundant. I had another job to go to. It's great. I've got some money in my pocket, nothing much to it. I'm going to go around and spend a bit of time. I'm going to spend 6 months traveling, go to 20 different countries to see as much of the world I can. And I have to admit, when I went to places, there were really quite large parts of the world, which at that point anyway, seemed to be doing quite well, booming, frankly. If you start from Britain, then, okay, 2008 meant we had a massive decrease in living standards, which a lot of people suffered. And now, because now we're going through a second sort of dip of that, thanks to, you know, oil prices and inflation, etc. But Britain's actually a bit of an outlier in the sense that people are actually facing difficulties about eating who 5 or 10 years ago weren't. That's not the global picture. The global picture actually is the other way around. What we do have in Britain, and you know, we've had in one form or another now for quite a long time, is that phenomenon of simultaneously wealth escalating in one part of society and wealth shrinking in another. So even if the general picture is kind of like the general picture of Britain is kind of flat, and the rest of the world is probably slightly inclined, but Britain, it's kind of that flatness and sudden redistribution. That's the stuff which causes people shocks and makes things absolutely unbearable. And I also think if you look at kind of the world in the same way, it's that relative inequality which is shocking. You know, a lot of the economists who I find useful for explaining along what's going on, this really isn't part of my book now, but people like Thomas Piketty, who talks about, for example, if you look at the United States, you know, real wages of people who just work for a living, those real wages are essentially where they were 50 years ago. But what's really, really shocking, which he talks about, is the disappearance of capital and rent out of people's consciousness or their ability to see it. So that you get these people who are so incredibly rich that we just don't comprehend how rich they are. An example of someone like Elon Musk, who's one of the billionaires whose wealth increased fastest under COVID. You know, at some point, I think when I was writing my book, I tried to work out, all right, if you turned Elon Musk's current wealth into a minimum wage income, just his current wealth, he makes no more money in his entire lifetime. It's probably made a lot more since I did this calculation. Turn it into minimum wage income. It'd be a minimum wage income without anyone need to have holidays, would mean that him, or imagine it's just like one descendant, one descendant, one descendant. Imagine they have no holidays, but like every day they're alive, you treat it as a minimum wage hour. Effectively, he's got enough wealth that 2 million years into his future, his descendants will still be getting an income every hour they're alive, equivalent to the present American minimum wage from that wealth. Now, there've only been human beings on the planet for 2 million years. So the idea that we can give anyone an amount of wealth that's got that number of noughts after it is just ridiculous. Piketty, when he was trying to talk about this process of like the rich opting out of, you know, like Marxists. I think one of the reasons why Marx isn't a more successful economist in people's heads than he should be, or as he should be, is because Marx is all about, or the Marx we understand is all about Capital Volume 1 and 3, which are all about what happens in workplaces and the economy. But the rich are opting out of the economy. If you've got $100 a year and you want to invest in stocks and shares in a company, you can right now, you can make on those stocks and shares, you make forms of wealth which earn you an income of say 2 or 3% a year. Problem is, inflation is 10%. So if your wealth, if your ownership is in those kinds of social relationships, it is being reduced. So the rich are finding ways of magnifying their wealth, which gives them faster than 10% increase on their income every year. And it gets really, really hard to track this because the really rich people, you know, think of someone like, say, Bill Gates. Bill Gates sets up Microsoft, makes, I don't know, $50 billion out of it, whatever it is, a long lost, one of the world's 10 richest men. At a certain point, about 15 years ago, he just got bored of Microsoft. He does not manage Microsoft. He doesn't make money for Microsoft. He does not need to. He's opted out of that relationship. And so Piketty tries to think, well, how's the economist? How do you even like know these things are going on? So he tried to, for example, measure how the disparity between the capital that's in the United States that exists that you might be able to measure, for example, I don't know, by looking at, say, the amount of wealth that's passed on when people pass on for inheritance purposes. We have to have some degree of honesty, yeah? There's really sophisticated mechanisms for measuring the difference between the wealth which is declared, so declared, for example, for tax purposes, and the wealth that actually is in the economy. And he's noticed that, you know, the amount of wealth that's vanishing out of all national, etc., accounting processes, getting up 40, 50, 60% of all wealth, it's just vanishing. There's no trace of it anymore. You couldn't tax it because it's not being declared for tax purposes, etc., etc., etc. Now, when wealth hoarding goes on like that, it then has all sorts of other negative consequences. One of the most destructive things in the States, if I was an American activist, the one legal project I'd be campaigning for is this: to abolish the rule which says that rich people in America, if they've got a tax bill, instead of paying it to the state, can give it to a private foundation, which, as long as its purposes are charitable, an extremely broad definition of charity, they can give it to themselves rather than giving it to the state. And what they do with these bloody foundations, they use them to bankroll all the worst politicians. The reason why, you know, Trump was able to find all these people and create this infrastructure, right-wing blogs and whatever around it, so all these rich people just giving dollar after dollar after dollar to foundations, which are warrening the universities in the United States, which are, you know, paying for huge amounts of money for their candidates to be advertised on TV, so their people getting in, etc., etc., etc. And you've almost like gamed it to have the rich people taking over democracy and, you know, leading it in ever more destructive fashions. And I say, part of the reason why I keep on coming back to climate crisis as part of this story is that if it was just as simple as, you know, you had rich people doing all this with their wealth, and most working people who are getting, you know, maybe in Brazil, Russia, India, China, their incomes are going up in real terms of 5% a year. Maybe in Britain, America, they're static or slightly falling. If that was all that was going on, that would actually be sustainable, unfortunately. What takes it beyond the level of sustainability is that this is now reaching the point where that economic model cannot maintain itself except by slowly taking more and more of the world's sustainable farmland out of farming, by making, by polluting, by drowning large parts of the world. The extent to which those natural elements are being destroyed is going up and up. And it's that, I think, which puts the kind of the brake on this process. That it just means that it poses, over time, it's going to pose for larger sets of people, not the super rich, because there are not that many of them, not the great majority of the poor, because conditions then are going to stay the same or slightly worse, but it's going to pose to more and more people in the middle of the question, which I think you see in Boris and his whole and the way his prime ministership was brought early. It's, do you really want these bastards to keep on doing it? Because actually, it's threatening even to people a bit below them, people who are a bit more in the middle, people who you know, maybe quite cowardly. Even they have to confront at a certain point that, you know, they want their kids to have a decent standard of living. They want there to be a world for people still to occupy. They want their grandkids to have a chance. And the things they are doing make that impossible. So I kind of think, again, that's my only hopefulness, that at some point things won't be like that bloody frog in the saucepan. At some point we're all going to turn and say, actually, no, you can't do this. This just doesn't work.
I mean, like, one of my, like, you know, all-time favorite quote, it's not like, you know, positive quote, but it makes lots of sense to me. I mean, so that's like the quote by Andrew Mellon. So he is a Treasury Secretary, like, you know, interwar period. I mean, he was so powerful. He was a banker himself, so very rich. He was so powerful that the government changed, but no one could actually get rid of him because he's so powerful.
Yeah.
So like from 1922 to, you know, up to, like, you know, Roosevelt came to power and then said, oh my God, we need to get rid of this guy, you know. So his famous quote is, crisis is good, because in a crisis, the asset always comes back to its original owner, i.e. him. So the crisis always brings assets back to the super rich people. So I mean, I think that
look, as an economic historian, I just know that's not true. If you look at the people who held assets in Germany in 1923, 90% of them who held assets in 1st January 1933 did not hold assets on 31st of December 1923. Not all crises have that consequence. It just depends on what exactly is the crisis you're talking about and who's capable of responding to it. And like just an example in Britain, one of the reasons why in Britain it's very hard to talk about socialism. It's not, I talked earlier about, it's very hard to believe in Marx when the things we all think Marx is talking about seem to explain less of what's going on in the world. Another example of that is just Marx's notion of insurgent working class taking on the rich in ever bigger and better battles till they win. It's very hard to believe that in a society and in a world where trade unions have had diminished power, where they're less visible in people's lives and so on. But one of the reasons why they are is that if you look at the economic crisis we've had in Britain for the last 40 years, when we've had them, they've all been against the backdrop of low inflation. Now, there's certain things you can say about the law to people in the context of low inflation. Let's say that you're workers in a factory and what you're really worried about is getting sacked. You can say to workers in that situation, right, we're going to pass anti-union laws to make it very hard to strike, and don't worry about that because they'll be bad, but we'll give you something good in return. We'll give you the chance to go to the employment tribunal, fight your disputes in legal terms, and at least then you'll get something back and you'll still get protection against dismissal and unemployment. That's essentially what Thatcherism said to the British working class in the 80s. Now, there are a bunch of reasons why it worked, if you can scale of the attack, but when you're in an inflationary moment like we are today, which we haven't been in Britain at any point in the last 40 years until now, that breaks down because as workers in a workplace, what you're interested in doing is no longer just or only defending your job, making sure you still have a job in a year's time. To some extent, you're thinking, shit, everything's going up by at least 10% a year. Some things seem to go up even a lot faster than that. If I want to maintain my standards of living, I have to think collectively. I have to consider, for example, going on strike. So you've got a crisis, but it's a crisis and certain organic features of the crisis actually have the consequence of forcing workers to reconsider collective action where they haven't done for ages. And then we see the results. It's things like the RMT strike. It's things like workers at Cadbury getting a 17% pay rise from the mere threat of strikes, without even actually carrying a strike out. So it really isn't the case that crisis always benefits the rich. Sometimes people shuffle into accidentally against their best intentions in forms of crisis, which means that other social forces can benefit. And I do think that's some of what's going on in Britain right now, is that the government has no concept at all how to prevent an inflation spiral. And because of that, they've allowed a situation to come about where just to slightly greater extent than a year ago, all trade unions, therefore all the people whose interests ultimately rise when trade unions struggles got, have just a bit more power than they did. And that's a nice situation to be in. And I think that's kind of what you have to do sometimes on the left. You have to see the moments of possibility in the present. You can't just go, all right, they're organising, they're getting away with it, they're winning. They are, of course they are. But sometimes they do things which actually make it possible for other people to organise against them.
So so that's the positive side of the story. It can trigger something. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because I mean, even if you look at last 10 years, we are talking about, it's a kind of crisis, isn't it? So the Brexit, things going on, lots of disruption, it's kind of lots of things we need to redo. And we saw...
But the left can't be. Again, this is one of the really big themes of the book. When I was a kid, it was just absolutely obvious to me, and as far as I tell everyone I knew, that the left were the people who stood for change in society. We wanted things to be different. The right wanted things to be the same. That's why they were called the conservatives.
Yeah.
Now, I think in the last 5 years, we've all wandered blindly into this mindset which says the right are the ones who are trying to change things. Any change is bad. The left exist in order to keep things how they are. Now, I just think it's a profound misstep politically for us now, hundreds of thousands, to respond to society in that fashion. Some crises end with our victory. If no crises end with our victory, we're doomed. Some have to. And we have to have a mindset which says, all right, things are changing. And most of those changes are bad. But yet, out of those changes could yet come things which create the possibility of a period of less hegemony, of a period where we swing society to the left over a long period of time. We have to think about the things that could make that possible. Because what's the alternative, Even if you were right,